Hi everyone, I'm Gary Shteyngart. Welcome to my bedroom. This is where I work. Well, before I publish any book, my father always asks me, will this book be good for the Jews? And my answer is always, I don't think this book is going to be good for anyone. You know, Canadians, Armenians, Scottish people, Jews. No one has ever benefited from appearing in one of my books. For my last book, my father took me aside and said, just don't write like a self-hating Jew. And I thought, me? Self-hating? Sure, when I was a young, furry immigrant, I felt a lot of anger at myself for not being what people wanted me to be. And yes, some of that anger drove me to commit the loneliest act of all, the act of writing books. But, you know, now, self-hating? Sure, when I was a young, furry immigrant, I felt a lot of anger at myself for not being what people wanted me to be. And yes, some of that anger drove me to commit the loneliest act of all, the act of writing books. But, you know, now, I love myself so much. It's illegal in some states. I love myself. But the only thing that now motivates me to write books is a healthy, artistic despair that's shared by creative people all over the world. Jews, Gentiles, and even Norwegians. Thank you, and have a good night.
I was struck at some point in my reading of many memoirs about the Holocaust by the difference between the early survivors' memoirs and the later survivor memoirs. The earlier ones were, in a sense, much more morally ambiguous and complex, and had a kind of, immediacy of reaction. And an immediacy of reaction unfiltered through preconceptions that to some extent sort of disappeared in the later memoirs. The later memoirs were written often through the filter and in the framework of what became the sort of public and collective a cult of memory and formulations of memory, so that certain tropes, certain ideas, return sometimes in a very formulaic way, so that the Poles are all very happy to see the Jews being, taken off to concentration camps. And this recurs again and again. The word Holocaust did not start coming into use until the 1960s. I know, from my own parents that they did not think of themselves as Holocaust survivors. They knew they had gone through something absolutely terrible, but they did not think of themselves through this phrase. Later, it was very difficult not to think of yourself in that way. So, in other words, there is a certain kind of, freezing of memory in the later memoirs as well. The whole relationship of the second generation memoirs and to the first generation memoirs is much more complicated, and in a sense, my interest in this issue comes from my sense that we need to complicate the very notion of memory, the very sort of phraseology of memory. I mean, the second generation, the children of survivors do not, even the direct descendants of survivors, my parents were survivors of the Holocaust, do not have memories of the Holocaust. Something very powerful has been transmitted to us, but I think it's sort of the sequela. It's the aftermath of terrible internal experiences. I mean, this is what is really transmitted. So that it's very powerful, and in a sense, I felt that I almost knew my parents' experience. I did know it, but I didn't know it. In a sense, the we also had to learn about the Holocaust as history, if we were to understand it. And there is something slightly dubious and slightly dangerous, perhaps, about this elision and about talking about memory of the Holocaust where there is not actual memory.
And life writing, I think, is particularly interesting from the point of view of writers and publishers right now for a number of reasons. One of them, I think, is because we're in the era of the selfie, and I think that feeling that the self that is more elliptical, that is getting lost through all these modes of self-presentation, is something that I think writers are trying to hold on to. And I suppose the decision of Laub to present, I think, events in his own life in the form of a fiction is, I think, an attempt to address what we were talking about, the first generation disavowal that was the narrator's grandfather, who deliberately obliterates his history, and then his own father's obsessive chronicling of the history, as if memory was something that could, in some sense, be relied on, is then shaken up by Laub, who recognizes that somehow what has been handed down to him, this fall, this trauma that is, and its legacy of guilt, because this, amongst other things, is a meditation on the tremendously corrosive effect on the soul of understanding oneself as a victim of history, and the things that allows you to do, the things that allows you to think, the beliefs that allows you to have. So he has, if you like, tried to work with the non-knowledge of one's own life, to investigate one's own life from the point of view of a novelist, because novels, as we know, are alive to ambiguity, to equivocation. They're not theses, they're not sure of themselves, and we don't come out of them feeling we know the answers. And I think, this is a work that is profoundly trying to not repeat a history of all kinds of traumatic repetitions. And so I think that the decision to fictionalize a life is part of the meaning of the life writing that this is also a meditation on. And incidentally, Knausgaard names this book as his favorite book of 2014, which I found fascinating as well.
When I was writing Hanns and Rudolf, which is about my great-uncle Hans, who tracks down the commandant of Auschwitz, I very much tried to take as far as I could, an objective point of view. I was trying to withdraw from my familial ties and tell it from a distance, and sometimes memory was confusing. Let me just move around here so you can see me. So, for example, there's a story that my great-uncle tells. He was in Bergen-Belsen, and at the dance on Boxing Day 1945, a young lady comes up to him and says, "Could you get me out of here? I'm desperate to get out of here." And her name was Anita Lasker, who's the cellist, who came from Auschwitz before that. She was a prisoner who got out. And he said, "Sure, no problem, and meet me tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. So the next morning, 9 o'clock in the morning, she waits by the gate with her sister. And my great-uncle doesn't turn up, and it's 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, eventually he turns up. And she's like, "Where have you been?" And he kind of apologizes. He was a bit of a troublemaker, a bit of a rogue. And she gets in the back of the car, and there's another girl in the back of the car called Lucille Eichengreen. Now, both Lucille Eichengreen and Anita Lasker have both written their memoirs about what happened. And I interviewed both of them, and they both tell totally different stories about what happened during that day. I mean, totally different stories. So one of them says, "We left Belsen, we go towards the Belgian border, we get to the border." I think this is Lucille. The guard says, "Hand over the papers." Hans says, "Here are my papers." He starts getting angry. He says, "You can't come across." So Hans tells the driver to gun the engine. These are her words, gun the engine. And they drive through the border. There's guns going off. They go down a ditch, up a ditch. They're ducking down. The bullets are going everywhere. Right? This is Lucille Eichengreen's story. Okay, she's around the same age as Anita Lasker. I asked Anita Lasker, and she says, absolutely not. They are literally sitting next to each other back of the car. They've got no reason not to tell the truth. Anita said, no, that's not what happened. We got to the border, and the border guard said, hand me your papers. And Hunt said, I am an investigation officer for the War Crimes Tribunal. Here's my papers. And he said, sure, no problem. Come on through the border. So this is part of the problem with memory, and how then it becomes the stories that people tell themselves, tell their children, tell other people through memoirs. Here's another example. I'm right now writing another book about our family has a house just outside, had a house they built in 1927. It was a weekend house outside of Berlin. And this book I'm writing about is about the 5 families who live in the house, and it's a way of telling the story of Germany through this house. And when I went back to Berlin a couple of years ago, I was full of longing and anger and angst, and this is my family's house, and I've been dispossessed, and the Nazis stole it and give it back, and all that kind of stuff. And for me, the traumatic event was 1935, when we were kicked out of Germany, and the Gestapo seized the house, and all these very familiar stories. But then when I started speaking to the people in the village, their traumatic event was totally different. It's the same geographic location, and for them, it's April 1945. The Russians come in the village, they rape a lot of the women, they take the properties, they're incredibly violent. So you've got the same geographic location, but you have a different traumatic memory. I found that quite difficult to deal with, actually, but very interesting. And the third story, sorry I'm talking too long, but the third story is from my own family. So again, through my research recently, for those who don't know, my family, they came over from Germany in 1935, but for the story that we've told ourselves is that we're survivors. We haven't lost anybody. And that's very much been the story of how, the identity that we've built amongst ourselves, that's our kind of foundation. Well, a few weeks ago, I was trying to research some of my family members, and it turns out my grandfather lost 5 members of his family in the Holocaust. 5 of his uncles and aunts, close family members. And I spoke to my father and his brother and sister, so the kids of my grandfather, and I said, did you know? And they said, no, he never told us. So that's a very interesting thing when memory is not being transferred down the generations, but also watching how we've reacted to the memory, and now how that's challenging our identity, and how memory is then controlled, both through intentional decisions to share information or the stories that we tell each other. So these are 3 different examples of memory and transfer of memory, who controls the memory, and why we share these stories.
Anyway, we had to make a choice, and in the end, we've given the prize to Thomas Hardings.
As this is probably going to be my only acceptance speech that I ever give, I'd just like to say just thank you very much. It's a total surprise. I'm quite shocked, if I'm honest. This last 2 years has been very difficult for me and my family. We lost our son in 2012, and in April 2012, I got a phone call from Tom Avery, who's sitting in the second row, from Random House. And this is after working for a year with Patrick, who very kindly, Patrick Wilshire, he's my agent, who helped me put the book together. And Tom said, we want this book. And this is after 6 years of working on a project which I never thought would be published. And I literally fell on the floor. I was in the garden, I fell on the floor because I didn't believe it was going to happen. And about a week later, I went for a walk with our son, Cadian, up in the hills behind our house. And you have to understand, for 6 years I've been working on this project, and none of us had thought it would ever get published. And he said, he was this wonderful, wonderful boy. He was 14 years old. And he said, "You need to understand, Dad, that up till now, when people have asked me, what do you do, I haven't known what to tell them." And he said, "Now I can tell them that you're a writer." And he said, "And I'm very proud of you." And so it really is a very special thing that you've done. And my wife here, Deb, she's been with me the whole way on this journey. So just thank you so much.